All right, this is part three. And in part three, we'll be thinking about some aspects of inequality, particularly economic inequality in relationship to economic globalization. As I've noted on the slide for you here, economic globalization is probably one of the most heavily debated forms of globalization, not just in sociology, in many other disciplines, and also in society at large. Debates about economic globalization and its relationship to inequality in particular have really been crucial in many contemporary political movements. So trying to understand this, I think, is quite important. So some scholars focus on the positive impacts of economic globalization, particularly its relationship to development and how it can help development in the global south. Others have been less positive and have linked it to new and more pernicious forms of inequality. What I wanted to talk about this debate, in part, I wanted to bring it up because I think it can relate to our discussion in weeks 1 and 2 of the functionalist and the conflict perspective. You'll remember that the functionalist is somebody who looks at a social phenomena and tries to understand how it benefits or helps the society, how it creates stability, how it might create development. Whereas the conflict perspective looks at that same phenomena and instead says, well, who benefits from that? How might that phenomena contribute to power, inequality, and hierarchy in the world? And I think you will see in our discussion how these two perspectives can be brought to bear on the topic of economic globalization, particularly on the question of why is economic globalization increasing? For the functionalist, it's because economic globalization benefits everyone, or mostly everyone, certainly most societies. For the conflict theorist, it's because certain groups are able to use the benefits of economic globalization to their advantage. And you'll see how we can play these two perspectives off against one another. We'll start with the example of the functionalist belief, and I think the key theory we want to be thinking about here is the theory known as Modernization Theory. So Modernization Theory is not a particularly new theory. It started to arise around about the 1940s or so. It's really a kind of Cold War type theory, if you will. It has remained popular to this day. It's contemporary iteration, particularly associated with the work of political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who wrote this book that I've pictured here. It's called The End of History and the Last Man, a very provocative title. But Fukuyama and the other modernization theorists essentially argue that there was this increasing social pressure or global pressure for countries to conform themselves to the model of liberal democratic capitalism. They argued that, especially towards the end of the Cold War, there was this growing awareness that socialist or communist systems would simply not work to provide for populations. The fall of the Soviet Union was really the key marker here, and the breakup of a lot of these former socialist countries. The idea behind modernization theory was that liberal democratic systems of governance and free market systems of capitalism had proved themselves to be superior for social stability, for peace, for economic development, for well-being, health, medicine, all these different types of things. And that because of that, there would be increasing pressure on countries to adopt these systems. And Fukuyama used the term the end of history because he believed that we would really start to see an end of political conflict. We'd no longer see these big civilizational divides between, say, capitalism and communism. Rather, everyone would eventually come to agree that liberal democracy, free market capitalism were the best ways to organize a society. You can see how this would reflect a very functionalist belief. So if you ask someone like Fukuyama, why is economic and political globalization happening? He would say that it's because most societies are recognizing that these forms, although they might have originated in, say, the European context, are the best forms, the best ways to arrange society if you want to target key markers of human development. Things like, again, literacy, welfare, nutrition, education, things like that. Okay, so they didn't say that it was inevitable that countries would adopt these kinds of organization, but they did say there was an intensive pressure for countries to do so because they had proven themselves to be so beneficial, let's say. Modernization theory was really the core of many theories of development during this time, and the idea was that if we wanted to develop countries in the global south, then the idea was to encourage them to adopt Western institutions. So you open up their markets, You break up autocratic regimes, you encourage democratic elections, you encourage human rights, those kinds of things. And in opposition to this kind of idea was this group of theories known as dependency theories. And they presented a very opposite view of why things like economic globalization were developing. Dependency theories fundamentally oppose the idea that countries in the global south needed to adopt these kind of Western institutions in order to have higher standards of development. Because for them, these institutions fundamentally were linked with the underdevelopment of the global south. So dependency theories typically argued that the success of developed economies, as they were often used to be called, depended upon the exploitation of developing economies. You can see the very traditional Marxist idea here. Remember, Marx has the idea of the upper classes and the lower classes, and the upper classes live by exploiting the lower classes in all human societies. Dependency theories applied this kind of idea to international relations, and they argued that there was a essentially upper class of nations, the contemporary West, the developed economies, and that the only reason their institutions worked so well for them was because those institutions were based upon the exploitation of developing economies in the global south. So dependency theory was a theory that emerged out of Latin America. It's a good example of a social theory which came from the global south. Some of its major figures include the book I've written here is by Ferdinando Cardoso, and it's a dependency and development in Latin America. And one of Cardoso's key ideas was that there was essentially this causal link between the wealth of the global north and the poverty of the global south. And some dependency theories had a very strong idea of this, that essentially as wealth grew in the global north, it would cause greater impoverishment in the global south. Some of them, and Cardoso was more in this latter camp, they simply saw that the effects of economic globalization were unevenly distributed, that they tended to benefit the countries in the global north much more than they benefited countries in the global south. And so dependency theories rejected the idea of modernization theory, that in order to develop themselves, these countries in the global south just needed to adopt Western institutions. They argued that they couldn't do that because the success of Western institutions fundamentally depended upon this class of exploited states. Okay, and you can see this as a good example of the conflict view. It comes from Marxism. It comes from this idea that there are an upper class and a lower class and chains of exploitation between them. And so if you ask a dependency theorist, why is economic globalization happening? Why is it spreading around the world? The dependency theorist would not say because liberal democratic capitalism is the best system. They would say it's because the global north is using its power to spread these ideas, particularly into the global south, in order to open up new avenues for exploitation. And dependency theories were very critical of, say, how institutions like the International Monetary Fund tried to open up and liberalize the economies in the global south, particularly in Latin America. And while it was believed by these institutions, let's say, that these kind of policies would create economic development in the global south, the rejoinder from dependency theories was that, in fact, it was just further exploiting the global south for the benefit of countries in the global north. So they were very critical of attempts to liberalize these economies in the second half of the 20th century. A very similar theory that was kind of associated with dependency theory, but slightly different in some ways, is what's known as world systems theory. And world systems theory was an explicitly neo-Marxist theory inspired by Marx, and its main advocate is pictured here for you. This was the theorist Emanuel Wallerstein. And Wallerstein came up with the idea of world systems theory, and it was really very similar to dependency theory in that it noticed a link between the success or development of the global north and the impoverishment of the global south. So world systems theory divided the world between what the systems theorists called core countries and peripheral countries. And the idea was that there were these core countries who the world system was set up to benefit. And these core countries were typically the Western countries, but really any industrialized country. Countries that focused on high-skilled labor, capital-intensive production, countries with very strong service sectors in particular. And these were contrasted to the peripheral countries where labor was still largely low skill and where these countries' economies were largely dependent upon the extraction of raw materials. the basic argument of world systems theory was that core countries were able to dominate peripheral countries in the world system. That the success of core countries depended upon the exploitation of peripheral countries, that the world system had been set up through processes of, say, colonization, where these peripheral countries existed as satellites just to benefit the countries in the core. So very similar to dependency theory, you have this idea of global exploitation, and the idea that it's not as simple as countries in the global south just adopting institutions like free market capitalism, because for world systems theorists, these institutions fundamentally existed to benefit the countries in the core as opposed to the countries in the periphery. You can see an example of a map here. This is an example of how the world systems theorists would divide up the world. And here you see not only core countries, but also periphery and semi-periphery countries. So there are some countries that are kind of in the border between these two aspects. They have aspects of core countries, but also aspects of periphery countries. But this kind of division very neatly maps on to what we typically term the global south or the global north, what used to be called the first and the third world during the Cold War. And again, the idea is that all these countries in red are basically exploited by the countries in blue, and that the wealth and the success of the countries in blue depends on the exploitation of the countries in red. I think world systems theory, whether you agree with it or not, gives you a nice taste of another theory which goes along with Beck's idea of international cosmopolitanism. So one of the problems with modernization theory as a theory was that it only really focused on countries themselves. So if you wanted to know, why were certain countries in the global south poor, modernization theories would typically look at factors internal to that country. What are its governing institutions look like? How protectionist is its economy? How open is it to the world economy? And typically the focus was on how can that country fix itself, politically, policy-wise, in order to create development. And I think while there have been criticisms levied against things like dependency theory and world systems theory, one benefit of them is they help you think about the world as a system, as a global system of production and exchange, where perhaps the wealth of some nations does come at the expense of others, although this point has been debated. What I've said here is that debate continues today between these various forms of views. Modernization theorists have had to temper some of their enthusiasm. Some of the more harder forms of dependency theory, which see a very strong link between northern wealth and southern poverty, those theories have been challenged as well. And I think today increasingly you see more complex, more nuanced theories which take into account decades of discussion and critique over some of these issues. And sociologists play a part in this debate. It's a debate which spans economics, history, development economics in particular, political science, social science, all kinds of fields are involved in these discussions. And I think that a lot of sociological theories are adding to this discussion by trying to change the way we think about the global economy and change the way we think about chains of inequality within it. Okay. I had an example of a theorist who you might be interested in here as well. This is Saskia Sassen here. She is a Dutch-American sociologist. And I think what's really interesting about Sassen is that she does take this more global position on inequality, and she helps us temper some of the analysis of theorists like Bauman and Castells. When we think about Bauman and Castells, the idea of the liquid modernity, the idea of the network society, there's almost a sense in these theorists that place doesn't matter at all anymore, that we've moved towards a globalized economy. Everything that's solid is melted into air. Place doesn't matter. Companies can move around anywhere they want to. People can move around anywhere they want to. And globalization has swept away all these old, outdated ideas that place matters. And I think Sassen gives you a really nice challenge to that kind of idea. Her argument was that if we actually look at the global economy as a system, there are all kinds of ways that place still really matters today. And Sassen was quite heavily focused on the emergence of what she called global cities. And these were cities like New York, London, Tokyo, increasingly places like Hong Kong as well, that she believed were really centers of global economic activity. And Sassen would say, if you actually look at major companies around the world, well, they don't just operate from anywhere. almost all of them have some kind of major presence in these global cities. Because it's in these cities that you find the best accountants and lawyers. It's where you have connections to all these kinds of global processes of commerce and exchange. So Sasson would say that cities still matter. And in these global cities, we do see a concentration of power, influence, economic resources as well. And so I think that's a very interesting idea she makes. Sasson also adopts some of the ideas of dependency theory because she examines the chains of inequality that exist within some of these global cities. If you look at theorists like Bauman, there's this sense that we're moving towards a increasingly professionalized, white-collar form of work. But Sasson says, well, actually, if you look at these global cities, a lot of that professional white-collar work is still dependent upon this immense underclass of particularly immigrant, low-skilled labor. Labor that is still very manual in nature. And so what Sasson does with analyses like this is try to make us question, when we talk about globalization and its impacts upon people, what people are we actually talking about? Are we generalizing the experience of a particular professional class living in these global cities? Or are we also thinking about what's going on for figures who are in the margins of these economies as well? Okay, for Sasson, globalization is not being experienced the same for everyone. Liquid modernity, network society, these things perhaps are only descriptive of the experience of certain classes of people, maybe in some cases even certain genders, certain racial groups as well. As I said, Sasson is really focused on immigrant labor in particular. And one thing Sasson notes is how the professionalization of workers in the global north is in many ways dependent upon this immense pool of immigrant workers who migrate into the global north from the global south, and many of these are women. And what Sasson notes, for example, is that there is this immense amount of women who move into the global north. Some come voluntarily, many are trafficked into the global north and into these global cities like Hong Kong, and many of them take over very traditional feminine roles. So they work as housekeepers, they work in childcare settings, in homes, for instance. And so, again, Sasson is noting here that she's drawing on the ideas of dependency theory because she's trying to point out, essentially, that in many ways the liberation of individuals in the global north, perhaps even the liberation of women in the global north, is in many ways still dependent upon this underclass of female immigrant labor who take over a lot of those traditional feminine roles. This is not true of everyone, for instance, but Sasson certainly thinks it's true of many of these professional classes in global cities like New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, etc. Okay. Sasson is also influenced by dependency theory because she asks the question, well, why are these immigrant women coming into these global cities in order to work? A lot of this is due to economic problems within countries in the global south. Economic problems that have arisen because many of these countries are heavily indebted to countries in the global north. And Sasson highlights quite interestingly how many of the economies in the global south are heavily dependent on the kinds of financial remittances that are sent back by immigrant women working in global cities. So many immigrant women come into cities like Hong Kong. They do traditional, lower class, low status, feminine kinds of occupations. The money they earn there is then sent back home into the global south. And many of the economies of the global south are dependent upon this kind of labor. So you can see Sasson here picking up on some of the ideas of dependency theory. That the professionalization of the global north is dependent upon the exploitation of immigrant labor in the global south. And that this exploitation is facilitated by the fact that countries in the global south are heavily indebted to economies in the global north. So there's a lot going on here. And again, there's a lot to explain as well, but the textbook chapter goes into more detail, so do have a look at that if you're really interested in this topic. I think it just gives you a sense of how you might think about things in a more systematic and global manner. And again, another good example of Beck's idea of methodological cosmopolitanism. If we think about something like feminism in the developing world, in the global north, it's actually quite interesting to think about how the liberation of women, the entrance of women into the workforce and into the professional classes, might in fact rely to some degree on this pool of immigrant women labor or on the exploitation of women in the global south. Okay, so that's the way. We're always thinking in this global sense. We're always trying to think of how changes that are going on might not be going on in the same rates in all classes, in all genders, in all races, how we can have a more holistic vision of social theory and inject those perspectives from the global south, which can challenge sometimes the narrow-mindedness of our perspectives with the theories that come from the global north. Okay. Just as one final example of this before we conclude, I wanted to show you an interesting map here of the interregional capital flows that are going on between countries. I think when we think about globalization, it's really easy to get carried away, especially coming from societies in the global north. So many of our theories come from America, from Europe. There are Australian theories as well. And we can often get carried away talking about this immense social process of globalization or the immense impact that globalization has had on our lives. But we do have to remember that our experience of globalization in these countries can be quite different to the experience of globalization in other countries, particularly in the global south. In that our economies and our countries might be far more plugged in to global networks than countries in the global south are. You can see here, this is a map of the interregional capital flows. It's a bit outdated now, but I thought it was a really nice visual here. And you can see that the dominant capital flows, the flows of money in the world, are largely going between certain areas. So you've got Northern America, Brazil, European countries, the Middle Eastern countries, some parts of Southeast Asia, and then Australia as well. But if you look at this map, there are several regions, several countries, particularly the African countries, who are relatively still unplugged from the global economy. So when we talk about the impact of something like globalization, we do have to think about that southern perspective as well. Are there countries in the global south for whom our analysis of globalization would not really apply, or who would feel like our discussion of globalization is not really capturing their country's experience or the experience of people in their country? Okay. I think this gives you a really good sense of where that southern perspective can come in to correct some of the biases that we might have in assuming that everyone around the world is going through the same kinds of process of globalization. Okay. All right, come back. We'll talk about part 4.